Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms presented by Diligent Institute. I'm Eric Shore and I'll be your host for this episode. Today I'm especially excited to speak with Cherie Axelrod, who serves as the Chief Enterprise Risk and Compliance Officer at Western Union. Cherie, thanks for joining us on the show.
Oh, Eric, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, no, great to see you as well. And it's been about a year since you transitioned from a role overseeing Western Union's audit function into your role as Chief Enterprise Risk Officer. And you mentioned you've recently added the title of Chief Enterprise Risk and Compliance Officer. Tell us more about your mandate and in particular what it is that you do to make sure that the risk management processes and procedures at Western Union are running as well as they can.
So as you said, it's been about a year since I've been in this role. This was actually a new role to the executive team. So we had a CEO change about 18 months ago, and he asked me to join his executive team as the Chief Enterprise Risk and Compliance Officer and bringing together different parts of the organization that were focused on risk, but were reporting up through different entities. So we brought in our payments risk, our compliance risk, our enterprise risk, and we brought those teams together in new and different ways, and so that we could get more synergy across the teams and we had greater visibility. So really this year has been about building those teams and creating that synergy in different ways that provide visibility to the board. I would say providing risk visibility more holistically. So rather than, compliance coming in and talking about compliance risk, enterprise risk coming in and talking about, risks at a very high level, by bringing these organizations together, we've been able to deep dive on some of the risks in new and different ways. So one of the things that this new role has as its mandate is to bring risk and risk visibility to the board in new and different ways. So for example, we talk a lot about our top 10 risks and our risk heat maps. And one of the efforts that we've done is by having these different groups underneath this one organization, we've now been able to double click and bring visibility to the board. For example, we're going to the board in September and we're talking about cybersecurity. And we're talking about cybersecurity as being one of our top 10 risks. And we're double clicking into cybersecurity to give visibility to the board around what does that really mean. And that really means looking at application security, looking at cloud security and cloud segmentation, looking at our agent security, because of course we have a large agent network, and taking those risks 1 and 2 levels down for the board so it makes it more real and more tangible to them, and that they can better understand what we're doing to control those risks and the remediation plans that we have in place. And then we're being very consistent on our updates to the board. We live this every day. Our board only comes and sees us 4 to 5 times a year. So the consistency is very important to them.
And that's really interesting and curious to hear your take on how do you make sure, especially as you double click, as you say, into some of these risks, that you make sure the information you provide them is accessible and actionable and isn't overwhelming.
We spend a lot of time preparing for them, and I try to make it very tangible. So if we're going to talk about cybersecurity risk, I'm partnering closely with our CISO. And when he's also presenting to our board. And so when I'm presenting cybersecurity as a top 10 risk and double clicking through these areas where we're working on improvements and enhancements, as all good companies do, then he comes right behind me in the board. And he also has these as top risks in his presentation. And he has then a scorecard that says how he is actually working holistically across the organization to buy down risk in these certain areas. So the continuity between the enterprise risk updates and then dovetailing into our CISO's update, give that clarity to the board and help them to connect the dots.
And you talked a bit about his report at a sort of a step up from that at the enterprise level. You talked about the top 10 risks. Curious, again, your take on the hallmarks of a good board level risk report. What kinds of things should be in there and out of there? So the physical report or what they see as compared to what they hear.
So we always start with an executive summary. We always talk about, where we've made progress, where we've completed our risk control and self-assessments, where we've completed reviews of our risk framework. And we're on about a 12-month cycle. So every time I go to the board, I'm taking a new segment of our risk framework and providing a specific update. So this time when I meet with the board in September, we're actually looking at our reputational risks and have there been any changes in that risk category. We're also looking at our operational risks, and we're talking about have there been changes in movement in those areas. And I spend time with them explaining the changes. I try to not be overwhelming. That's why I do it segment by segment, meeting by meeting, so that we hit the entire risk framework every year. Sometimes things happen and risks change. As you can imagine, for us here at Western Union, Eric, geopolitical risk is a big, high risk for us. We operate all over the world. The other morning I woke up and looked at the news, and there'd been a coup in Gabon. And so I spent the morning thinking about what that meant for us. And then we actually spent some time making sure that we understood, were there any people that we needed to make sure we're safe, what was happening with our agents. And so for me, if there's nothing that changes, I follow my normal cadence. Every meeting, I'll do another part of the risk framework. And if there is something that changes, then I'll call that out directly. But I would say the reason that we've been successful this past year with the board is consistency in our messaging. I'd say, here's what we told you last time. Here's an executive summary of what we're telling you this time. And here's what you should expect next time you see me in December.
So lots of planning with the expectation that something inevitably will happen and you'll need to pivot, but at least you have a framework that's in place and you end up covering most of what you prepare to do. Final question for you is, in your role, you have exposure to lots of risks, both inside and outside of your company. What keeps you up at night?
I don't think there's a risk officer in the world who's not concerned about cybersecurity. No matter how many practice sessions, how many tabletops, how much technology, it just feels like the bad actors are proliferating faster and faster and getting more sophisticated. So that for sure, given our global nature, it is rare that something happens in the world that we are not in some way impacted by, usually small things. So when the hurricanes hit Florida last week, we had some, slight impacts as our agents were unable to operate for, a short period of time in a small, locations. I mentioned the coup in Gabon that happened last week as well. It was generally a peaceful coup, which is good. So our locations were able to stay operating. But every day when you get up and read the global papers, when something is happening, whether it's weather, political, monetary policy changes, Western Union is generally somehow impacted. And so for me, that makes this job super interesting, never boring.
Well, that's the perfect way to end, Cherie. We've covered a lot in a short period of time. We really appreciate you sharing your great perspectives with our audience. So thanks for taking the time today. To our viewers, we will see you next week with another episode of Inside Today's Boardrooms.